Hey, what's up? This is Harry Wagner from Harry Situations, and today I want to talk to you about the age-old question: which is better off-road, independent front suspension or a solid front axle? Now, I'm going to give you my age-old answer, which is it depends. What does it depend on? We're going to go into all of that in detail, and we're going to talk about the mechanics of these vehicles here behind me and put them through their paces. So we have a Jeep Wrangler with a solid front axle and a Ford Bronco with independent front suspension. Keep watching to see which one works better when. Now, 40 years ago, when you bought a 4x4, it almost was guaranteed to have a solid front axle, and probably leaf springs too. If you bought a Suzuki Samurai or a Toyota pickup, if you bought a dent-side Ford or a square body Chevy, they all had solid front axles, and with the exception of the Ford, they all had leaf springs as well. So what's changed over the last 40 years? Well, a lot less people buy cars these days. People use trucks as cars. So we've seen the cabs get bigger. 40 years ago, it was rare to have a crew cab. Now it's rare to have a regular cab. They used to have 8-foot beds. Now they have 5.5-foot beds. So we see a lot of more creature comforts in trucks. And one of those creature comforts is independent front suspension. So there are still a few vehicles you can get with a solid front axle. They include Ford Super Duty, which axles are donors for a lot of vehicles that go into solid axle swaps. Also, Ram heavy-duty trucks, Mercedes G-Wagons. I don't know if anyone watching this video can afford one of those. I can't, but they're cool. And the Jeep Wrangler, the ubiquitous Jeep Wrangler, still comes with a solid front axle. Everything else on the market, your Toyota Tacomas, your 4Runners, Ford Broncos, all have independent front suspension. Now, you might be wondering, what do these terms mean? Let's go into a little more detail before we actually put these vehicles through their paces and put them to use. So a solid front axle, as the name implies, is like a beam. Both sides are connected, and that can be suspended by leaf springs. As I mentioned, you can have coilovers, you can have coils, but what happens was when you hit a bump, this side goes up, this side wants to go down, the entire chassis kind of gets unsettled. For rock crawling, solid front axles rule the roost. You still see them in rock buggies all the time. Now, if you want to go fast, independent front suspension is better, and as the name implies, you hit a bump, this side goes up and down, it doesn't upset the rest of the chassis, it doesn't transfer over to the other side. So how that works is the differential is actually fixed in the chassis, and then you have A-arms out at the frame. Those go a cycle up and down, typically with something like a coilover strut in the case of this Bronco or Tacomas and 4Runners. There are other ways of suspending the axle, torsion bars, things like that, but we're not really going to get into detail here. You might be wondering which one is stronger. We hear a lot of times that solid front axles are stronger, and that can be the case, but again, it depends. It's not always the case. The differential, really the strength of that is a function of, does it have an aluminum case that maybe can flex or crack? Does it have a steel case? What's the size of the ring gear? What's the size of the differential? How many splines does it have? How big are the axle shafts? These are the things that determine how strong something is, and they're independent of whether it is a solid axle or independent suspension. Same with outers, brakes, unit bearings, knuckles or uprights. Those things can be strong or weak depending on their size, and it's not a function of whether it's a solid front axle or independent suspension. Now, the joints are where things get a little more complicated, because with a solid front axle, the steering in the front when you turn, there has to be something to account for that. So you typically have a U-joint with 2 axle shafts. Maybe you have a constant velocity joint like an RCV, and that can account for that steering angle when you turn. Now, with independent suspension, you typically have a CV shaft, and it needs to account for that steering, but also the suspension movement up and down. So those have to be a lot stronger because they're accounting not just for the steering, but for the suspension movement as well. So that's why we hear a lot of times that a solid front axle is stronger. In my opinion, it's simpler. That joint has less to do, but I wouldn't say that explicitly a solid front axle is stronger. There are IFS out there that is definitely stronger than a Dana 30 front axle that you would find in something like a JK. Behind me, we've got 2 vehicles. We've got a Jeep Wrangler JL and a Ford Bronco. One has a solid front axle, one has independent suspension. The thing they both have in common is that they are on 37-inch Nitto trail grapplers, so traction won't be an issue for either of them. This video is actually brought to you by Nitto. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the Driving Line channel and don't forget to like.
My name is Mitch Bergstrom. I actually own an off-road shop right here in Sparks, Nevada called Silver State Off-Road. We do everything from, regular lift kits, bumpers, armor, to full solid axle swaps and frame off builds pretty much. So I did not do a solid axle swap on the Bronco. I've had plenty of solid axle swapped crawlers in the past. I still have one on 40-inch tires. They both serve a different purpose to me. I like what the solid axle brings as far as just rock crawling, of course, simplicity, but the IFS of the Bronco is pretty hard to beat as kind of an all-around do-everything well rig. This Bronco is pretty well traveled. I've wheeled the Rubicon Trail multiple times right here at Moon Rocks quite a bit as it's in our backyard. Drove it all the way to Sand Hollow, actually towed my boat down there, wheeled for an entire week, bashed it through the dunes, towed my boat home with no issues. I've had some issues with the front end as far as braking, so I upgraded the axle shafts to RCVs before I ever even had a chance to break a stock one. Same with the steering, I upgraded all that and haven't physically broken any of the components, but the diff mount where it mounts to the frame has ripped off a couple of times, so I had to pull the entire front axle out, fabricate a mount for it myself, which is an issue I haven't seen on any other Broncos in the country besides mine for some reason. So I am pretty hard on it, and that's the one major issue that I've had. The modifications to this Bronco include obviously full armor underneath, front and rear bumpers. It has RCV axle shafts, Carli chromoly steering that is double shear Heims at the knuckle. It's got the upgraded steering housing on the one side, the bushing on the other, and other than that, it's stock drive shafts, stock rear axles, stock arms, things like that. It does have Dobinson's MRR 3-way adjustable coilovers on it, so that helped with the suspension as far as ride. Not necessarily an upgrade in strength, but it's nice to have the adjustability on the shocks. So with the Sport Track that I had, I did take out the IFS and IRS for solid axles, 1 ton. Being that it weighed almost 7,000 pounds, it was really long, and there's just no aftermarket support for any of the IFS, IRS that was on that vehicle, so there was no way to really build something to hold up to what I was going to do with it. It did great on technical trails, off-road, and it was a pretty comfortable family crawler to hit dirt roads fast and things. And it was still pretty streetable to drive to and from the trail, wheel all weekend, get you home. But it was just a big, heavy vehicle that, it needed a lot of maintenance. Even with 1-ton heavy-duty axles, it would smoke a wheel bearing every season or two, and you'd have to go through and replace drive shafts because there's a lot of stress on them. The Bronco is kind of just turnkey, go, beat on it pretty hard, and give it a quick nut and bolt check, and it's usually in pretty good shape afterwards. The Bronco weighs about 5,500 pounds stock, so with everything that I've added to it, I'd say I've added at least 500 or 600 pounds, so somewhere around 6,000. It's still not the lightest, but it has a lot more power, and being an automatic, and even though the Sport Track had a V8, this has twin turbos and a lighter drivetrain and a little bit more ground clearance, so at some points you have to kind of drive this thing like a UTV and just bump through lines and carry momentum, and the old school crawler guys see you doing that and they just think you don't know how to drive, but in this vehicle sometimes you have to. Yeah, so definitely I've always been a diehard Ford guy. All my crawlers that I've built, I've taken the hard route and not built a Jeep or a Toyota or something with bolt-on parts. So as soon as they announced the comeback of the Bronco, I was definitely going to buy one either way. I liked the idea of having something that I can just buy parts, put them on, wheel it, because none of my vehicles have ever been able to do that. Although now I'm finding I put some of the early available Bronco parts on, and I'm like, I need to build this and do it different, but build it myself instead. So I'm already kind of getting away from the bolt-on idea, although a lot of it is. But yeah, not gonna lie, when they first announced that it was coming back with IFS, I was bummed at first, and then I learned to like it now, if you will. So the difference between, say, my old Sport Track, which was on 1-tons and coilovers all around, and the Bronco, and wheeling some of these technical lines, is that a lot of the times where the Sport Track kind of just slinkies through stuff, the Bronco will lift the tire here and there, although it always feels stable, and kind of that's the rule of thumb I wheel with in this thing. If your dash is flat, you're okay. Some of these lines I'm doing and my tires are lifting, and people are like, wow, it looks bad, but it always feels fine. And it's honestly surprised me in some of the really technical twisty stuff where it stays stable. It definitely takes a little more driver skill and work to get the Bronco through some of this stuff, but it does it all pretty well.
Yeah, my name is Matt Wan, born and raised here in Reno, Nevada. Grew up hunting, camping, fishing, all that stuff, so I've always been around off-road vehicles. This is my 2020 Jeep Wrangler Rubicon Unlimited. I built it kind of as a need. I didn't at the time have something that I could drive to the trail, say like Rubicon or hunting or camping. I only had a rock crawler and a tow rig, so this kind of fit that need that I needed at the time. So the whole thing is based around a Metal Cloak 2.5-inch Game Changer lift. I did the fender chop in the 37s, and then everything else around it is either armor, bumper sliders, belly skids, also skid plates on the axles. Then there's things like, from the factory, these come with aluminum knuckles and really bad ball joints, so that was an instant I needed to do that right away. Stronger steering, and a lot of upgrades just to kind of keep things a little bit stronger. Yeah, so I originally bought it was my second rock crawler, but it was started bone stock as a 1998 Toyota pickup. Had IFS, 27-inch tires. I did a solid axle swap, and by the time I was done with it, it was LS swapped, 1 tons, 40s, full cage, hybrid interior-exterior cage, no windows, so got a little out of hand. I did not consider an independent suspension vehicle. I like the simplicity of solid axles, and you could just fit big tires under these from the factory with a low lift. So I do have a 6'8" height requirement to fit in a parking garage at work, so it had to be able to fit big tires and stay low. Yeah, so when it comes to cars, independent front suspension all the way. Currently building a 92 Camaro with a 6-liter LS swap, and want to do some road racing maybe or some autocross, so independent front suspension, good struts, all the way around is kind of the way to go for that for me. Yeah, so the big thing I wanted to do is I've got chromoly axles in the rear, RCV axles up front, all the diff covers, differential skids. I welded on a truss because the CAD or FAD, whatever they're calling it nowadays, that's known to break right at the axle, kind of snap the axle off. And then the ball joints, the steering, all aluminum steering, so you can kind of hit a rock and it bounces back. Anything that I could do to make it stronger and kind of be a little more worry-free on the trail. Yeah, my Chevy's more of a tow rig. The Toyota, when I first bought it, I did have to swap a new engine in, and 6 months into owning it, swap an engine in, I wanted to get it out on the trail. It did not do very well. Open differentials, IFS, small tires, but it was nice to see what it did. What I like with this is it's really streetable. The older you get, the more you like creature comforts. So heated seats, heated steering wheel when it's cold. I've been out top off when it's 40 degrees outside, getting to a trail. Then you have full air conditioning. The 8-speed transmission in these should just be put in everything. That ZF is great. The engine, it's adequate in power, adequate in reliability. There's better engines, there's worse engines. It's just a very streetable rig. I know a lot of people say solid axles can't drive great on the road, but if you set them up correctly and you use good parts, they drive great. You see a lot of people that cheap out and get like a 3-inch budget boost. No control arms, no caster adjustment, no steering adjustment, and they wonder why it rides poorly. If you do control arms, adjustable control arms, get your caster dialed in, more caster than the factory would like, good steering, because these do have some steering issues from the factory. They drive straight, smooth down the road, and it's nice because you could do, with a solid axle, you could do an alignment in your driveway with some alignment plates and a tape measure. So it's very easy to do and make changes on the fly.
Now that we've put both of these vehicles through their paces, we can make some observations. The bulk of our time was spent in the rocks, and honestly they both work really well with locking differentials and 37-inch Nitto trail grapplers. The Jeep is more stable. Mitch commented that with the Bronco, you have to drive it a little differently with the IFS. You have to carry more momentum rather than crawl everywhere you can with the Jeep. The limiting factor on both of them seemed to be the steering, to be honest. When they were bound up in the rocks, both of them had a hard time steering. If this was my Jeep, I would probably add a PSC big bore box, which is actually what I have on my LJ, or hydraulic assist like I have on my Ford. On the Bronco with the IFS rack, 74 weld makes an upgraded replacement, and that's probably the way I would go if that was my vehicle. On both of them, I found disconnecting the sway bar helped, not only in the rocks, but also in high speed as well. It allowed the axle and the suspension to move and to work. The Bronco was better at high speed. I don't think there's any question about that, but honestly, whether you're in the desert or the sand dunes, I think that having more horsepower from the turbocharged engine of the Bronco is as big of a factor as the solid axle versus IFS. On the street, I'll give the nod to the Bronco. I think it is better than the Wrangler is with regards to street manners. They both have some road noise. Both of them have the tops off right now, so the noise is going to be loud no matter what. But even with the hardtop on the Bronco, it's just as loud as a Wrangler is. And the Jeep's no slouch, honestly. The JL is the best road manners that any Wrangler has ever had. On this model, they lowered the spring rate, they moved the shocks outboard, they added a stiffer sway bar, which is great on the road, and then with the Rubicon, the ability to disconnect that sway bar off-road is really nice. I mean, at the end of the day, both the Bronco and the Wrangler are great platforms for just about any situation, on-road or off. So, wheel whatever you own.
That's it for this episode. Hopefully you learned a thing or two. I know I certainly did. And really the biggest takeaway is wheel what you got. If you want to go rock crawling, you need armor, you need locking differentials, you need good tires, and you need good steering. If you want to go fast, things like bypass shocks, good suspension that's dialed in, lots of wheel travel will help you regardless of what you're driving. Post below and let me know what your favorite vehicle is for going off-road.
Thanks for watching Driving Line. If you guys like this video, consider subscribing to our channel so you'll never miss any of the content we create here. Whether you're into trucks, Jeeps, imports, domestic vehicles, or anything in between, we are here to fuel your passion. So hit that subscribe button and we'll see you guys next time.